The Lord be with you. Please join me in saying our opening prayer. God, by whom the meek are guided in judgment, and light rises up in darkness for the godly, grant us in all our doubts and uncertainties the grace to ask what you would have us do, that the Spirit of wisdom may save us from all false choices, and that in your light we may see light, and in your straight path we may not stumble, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. I want to comment on how well you do that, and also just to notice how, as Episcopalians, we add punctuation in certain places where it isn't there. Here's the amazing thing. We all do it pretty much the same way. So if you go to another church with another prayer, you'll see the same kind of treatment there. That means that God is with you. All right. Knowing that God is with us, what in the world are we doing? We are reading Genesis. And why? We're reading it because despite being different stories coming from different places at different times, I believe, and I'm trying to persuade you, that it's one coherent narrative. The first part prepares us for the arrival of God's new way for life, and the rest enables us to learn what that might offer, God's new way, and what it might require of us. What is the new way? Using the words of the Old Testament, we would say that the new way is inaugurated by the election of Abraham. Of course, we then repeat that. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Leah and Sarah and Rebekah. We'll repeat that forever because that's where the Old Testament sees this new way being inaugurated. And it's two things. It's the practice of righteousness and it's a pursuit of holiness. Righteousness and holiness. Righteousness is about our relationship with others, being in right relationship with others. Holiness is about our relating to God, how we relate to the divine. You will recognize this, I hope, as paralleling, or at least being the sources for Jesus' summary of the law. What is the summary of the law, which in the old days we used to repeat at the opening part of Rite 1, Eucharist, and still do in some forms of the daily office, right? Give everything you got to God and love other people. Same thing here, righteousness and holiness. Well, how are we reading Genesis? This is where we're departing a little bit from most Bible studies and perhaps other Bible studies that you have participated in. We're reading it what I'll call philosophically. This is Immanuel Kant, so you get the great believer in reason. We're reading it philosophically in the sense that we're looking for meaning and understanding. We're not looking for textual differences. We're not looking for relevancies to other parts of the text. We're not looking for who did what and out of what tradition it came, unless that helps give us meaning and understanding. Because what we're trying to do as followers of Jesus is figure out how to live the way Jesus wanted us to live. How to live the way Jesus wanted us to live. And I think the foundations of all of that are in the Old Testament. Even Jesus' summary of the law, of course, is a summary of the law. He is abstracting from Leviticus and Deuteronomy in saying what he's saying, and he wasn't the first person to say it, though, of course, we will argue that he says it a little bit differently. So we're reading Genesis philosophically. So you were great last week. And what I asked, my opening question was, what strikes you? What gives you energy about it? You'll recognize that kind of strategy from Lectio Divina. It's an honored way of reading the Bible. Just what pops out at you? What did you recognize? You can have some confidence, as Christians have for centuries, that God is speaking through that energy. Something about what you noticed is meaningful, so follow it. And we did for what was a wonderful but somewhat far-ranging conversation. So I went this week and thought and prayed about three things that I thought arose out of that discussion that we could kind of deal with in a more concrete manner this week. So I'm going to, this week, try to focus us on three questions. Question number one, did God make women subordinate to men? You're going to be able to go to brunch afterwards, don't worry. Did God make women subordinate to men? Now notice I didn't say, did Eve trick Adam? That's how it's often phrased, but I want to look at it a little bit deeper than that. But the second question is, did Eve trick Adam into eating the apple? Did Eve trick Adam into eating the apple? And the third question, why did God expel Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden? Now, there are many questions we could have followed up on, but I think these three capture most of what you were interested in. So we'll take them one at a time. Did God make women subordinate to men? Please hold your questions and comments until the end. Here's the the scripture I want to look at. I know you can't read it, so I will. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man. Man in Hebrew is a word that means human being, or Adam. Adam just means human being, or as I learned in seminary in my Greek class, not a rock. That's how the Greek was defined, not a rock. I know some of you are saying, well, sometimes, but not a rock. So it has a gender for purposes of grammar, but it doesn't necessarily indicate a gender for purposes of person. You with me? We translate it as man, but if you go, and that didn't have a gender either when it was originally translated. We've since thought about whether that is a good thing to do. But my point is when you read Genesis and you see the word man, that does not mean a male human being. All right. Nevertheless, we're going to use that male gender. And he, Adam, slept. And he, God, capital H, he took one of his ribs and closed up the place instead with flesh. And the Lord God built the rib, which he had taken from the man, Adam, into a woman, Ishash. And he brought her to the man. And the man said, this one at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, Isha, because from man, Ish, this is the ultimate Hebrew, this one is taken. So you can see the etymology similar in those words, right? So woman is derived from, but different from, man. All right, Bible trivia. Anybody recognize these two? Adam and Eve? Adam's rib. What year was Adam's rib? Does anybody remember? I meant to look that up for you. Anyway, Adam's Rib, which is one of my favorite movies with Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn, and it's kind of an early exploration of feminist thought, really, and intentionally so, but wonderful, wonderful movie. They're both lawyers, which makes them good people. And we learn all kinds of things about gender stereotypes that we have utilized. But the first sentence, this one at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. All right, I'll get you through the cocktail party. See, this is very important. You come to church and learn these little things. All right, so there's an old story about what this means. I'm going to critique the old story, tell you what I think is wrong with it, and then offer a story to live by. Now, I hope I persuaded you that in reading the Bible, there's not one right interpretation. There's some wrong ones, but there's a whole lot of room for different right ones, that is to say, helpful ones, those yielding wisdom. And in fact, as my father used to remind me, every generation has to interpret the Bible anew. Every generation has to interpret the Bible anew. Why? It's not because their forebears were stupid. It's because the world changes. The culture in which we live changes. Just think about what the words our children say, some of which you've never heard before and probably don't. I mean, I watch TV shows and I have to go look up what they're saying because the slang is beyond me. Not that it's guttural, it's just I've never heard it before. Or I'll say things in staff meetings at church and our young staff members will look at me like, George, what in the world? And I'll say, do you guys not remember that? That is from this TV show. And they will say things like, we were not born when that TV show aired. And I have to break it down into some stilting English. So there's an old story, I'll critique it, and a story to live by, which you don't have to agree with because it's right, but it's not the only right answer. And in another generation, they'll be interpreting anew anyway. That is the fun part of the Bible. It's not a rule book, not a science text, not a history lesson, right? Even though it has rules and science and history in it. Okay. So, what's wrong with the old story? All right, hang with me to the end here. Man's origin is dust, which is lower than woman's origin, which is the rib. Man is rendered incomplete, less than whole in the process. He's minus part of him, and he knows it. And he knows it. He will always be looking, so the story goes, for something that he lacks, something that he is missing. This, of course, gives rise to the other idea that men and women are two halves of a whole, and so they're always looking for the right other half in order to perfect the whole. Perhaps you've heard that. I'm not arguing that. I am arguing that Adam knows he's looking for something. The woman is created not with a deficiency. Remember, the issue is subordination. The woman is created not with a deficiency, but with an excess. What is the excess? She's able to bear children. She's able to create new life. That's what the woman is able to do, that the man is not. She is overflowing in her capacity for generating new life. The woman has been created in order to be a counterpart. Man's helper is not to be, in Hebrew, neged. What is opposite to him, the woman is to be. What is opposite to him, over against him, boldly in front of him, or if you will, in his face. Who knew? All that's just natural. She is to be an opponent, contrary to man. And what I want you to take out of this is just interpreting the Hebrew, what I want you to take out of that is they were intended to be equal and compatible and necessary for each other. Can you see that? How to hear equal, compatible, necessary for each other. That's what's wrong with the old story. It's not just that woman was subordinate to man. If you look a little bit deeper, you'll see a very different truth. So what's a story to live by? How might we think about this? Well, what if the difference in man and women's origins is not really about rank or status to begin with? What if that question is the wrong question? What if the difference is in the character of the male and female desire? Not rank or status, but desire. Look at it through that lens. Every act of speech reflects some often hidden motive that incites it, of course. The first human speech, remember we looked at our Bible trivia, is incited by and expresses human desire. When he, Adam, names Eve, as he has all the other animals, he sees himself for the first time. Pause. Do you see that? When Adam names Eve, all the other animals he's given names to, they're descriptive, and we'll think later about what he might be naming, because no name captures all of that animal, right? So he had to start making some distinctions, right? How you refer to each other when the other isn't present says something about that person, but not everything about that person. My name, George, says something about me. It may help identify me. It may tie me to my father, but it doesn't say everything about me. No name can. But when Adam looks at Eve and names her based on him as if her name is derivative of his, he has to see himself. Does that make sense? He has to see himself, which is the first real evidence of self-consciousness, of self-awareness, right? Now we know, and at least we believe, that as children develop, they're into this earth and living and breathing and eating for a while before they have any sense that the image in the mirror that they see is actually them, right? That gaining of self-consciousness doesn't happen until I don't know what current thoughts are, a year, 18 months. I mean, it's a while before that self-awareness develops. So the idea is that in the garden, Adam existed for some time having no sense of who he really was, not thinking about him. He may have thought about what he needed or what he was commanded or what he was told, but he wasn't thinking about himself. And if he wasn't thinking about himself, he probably wasn't worrying or anxious or even desiring much. So the naming there suggests that Adam sees himself for the first time in Eve. And it is he, Adam, and not God, who is speaking, and his name for her defines her in light of his possessive desire for her. So this is Kaas's conclusion, that what's really happening here is not a ranking in status, who's subordinate to who has power over whom, who ought to be telling who what to do, but instead desire. And then Kaas says, and this is hard for some of us, when he starts talking, he's not even talking to her, is he? He's talking about her. Do you see that difference? He's not talking to her, he's talking about her. That's going to come up later, but I want you to have that distinction. So it gets pretty hard when you're thinking about the story to live by to go back and say simplistically, if people have for generations, oh, well, Eve was created out of Adam. Adam named Eve, consistent with God's giving Adam, man, human, maleness, the power to control, and therefore women ought to be subordinate to men. Right? If you look more deeply at the Hebrew and you think about the functioning of these characters in the story, I think it's impossible to reach that conclusion. Do you see that? I think it's impossible to reach that conclusion. It ignores the Hebrew. It ignores what they're actually working out. And what Kaas suggests is this isn't about rank and status to begin with, so don't worry about all of that complicated analysis. It's really about desire. What's driving us? What motivates us? Why are we doing what we do? Desire. And this will captivate Christian thought from then until now, right? With Augustine being a great accelerator in our focus on desire. Desire's not a bad thing here, but it's a driving thing. Some of us who've worked in advertising before believe it's the primary thing, right? Or at least the advertising industry does, right? Nobody's making rational decisions about what they're doing. It's the desire that you're trying to provoke or stimulate. All right. Here's the question. Any questions about that analysis before we go to our discussion, which will require microphones? All right. Here's the question I want you to think about relative, because what I like to do is take all this stuff and then bring it down to your own life. What does it feel like in our own lives? So can you think of a time when the name you gave someone or something defined them in a way that said more about you than about them? Can you think of a time when you named something and then realized that the name you gave them said more about you than it said about them? I'll give you a funny example. When I was, while you're thinking, my son, after having graduated from law school, met and was engaged to a woman who'd grown up in Seattle. And there was a point where they were going to Chicago and he was going to meet all their friends for the first time. And he was admittedly a little anxious about all of that. And I said, son, it's not going to matter. They love her, so they're going to love you. And he said, oh, Dad, no. They're going to take one look at my boat shoes, and I'm going to be climbing uphill all night long. Why? Because boat shoes are the icon for Southern State University frat boy, right? So his boat shoes, which he wore anyway, I would have not worn them because I'm a coward, but he wore his boat shoes. He's like, bring it on. Well, sure enough, that's what happened. Why? Because they named him, but in naming him said more about them than him. See how that works? Naming them said more about them than him. It reflected their own prejudices, their own fears, their own anxieties. What they named him, not in the sense of a formal name, but in their hearts, what they named him was Southern, smart-ass, white boy. That's what they named him, right?
So the nut doesn't fall far from the tree, right?
It is pretty funny to watch the two of us when we go out because it's like, oh, the clothes have not changed. His are tighter, but that's about it. Yeah, so naming in terms of a name, if you name somebody, I hate you because you're X, well, that's obviously not all of them. And the fact that you thought they were X says more about you than them. But we also name somebody every time we put them in a category, right? Every time we think we've got them, they're in a box. And if you don't believe that, think about how you feel when you feel you've been put in a box. Well, you're just a server on an airplane, right? I mean, when I think I've been put in a box, I pretty much explode. So I think this is all real. Yes?
My grandfather named his son George Jr. My daddy named his son George III.
Yeah, I would have too, but for my children's mother. Yeah.
I was just going to say we've all named our children if we have them, and that obviously doesn't say anything about them because we don't really know anything about them when we give them a name. But it says about who we revere. If you name your child after your mother or your grandmother or somebody you care about, it just says something about who you think highly of or want to honor. Doesn't say much about the child who gets the name.
Right, exactly. And even and remember the tradition, I said, I've been talking about Abraham, but remember he was Abram until being inaugurated, then he's Abraham. And Sarah's name changes, and if you go into a monastery today, when you take your formal orders, they will change your name. Or if you become Pope, they will change your name. Same idea. All right, yes ma'am, sorry.
So mine is sort of like a nickname. I have a nephew. He's 6 years old, but I think about the age of 2, I gave him the nickname the Mayor. When he began to talk, he just talked everybody's business somehow. He knew everyone's business. You kind of had to spell words around him. But I also saw the greatness in him. And at 6 years old, he's still talking. He can still articulate everybody's business. You have to be very careful of what you say around him. It's like he has an old soul. But I could already see the greatness in him. So I call him the Mayor because he knows everything. He knows everyone's business. And he knows more than you know. And so I named him the Mayor.
I love that. That's a great story.
The Mayor of Miami, actually.
Yeah, you were reminding me of a moment at the dinner table when I thought it would be fun to have dessert, but I wasn't sure the kid's mom was gonna really want to do that. Her name is Catherine. So I looked at Catherine and I said, do you think we could have Oreo? And the kid said, we'd love an Oreo. That'd be great. I wasn't as smart as I thought. All right.
So I have a nickname story too. My son is the 4th, Mason. And I come from a long and extended family of people who call each other by nicknames, many times multiple nicknames. So but I was resisting the urge to call him what seemed to me the natural nickname, which is May, because that was my aunt. So this went on for a few years, still me resisting, other people making up nicknames, and none of them sounded quite right because I wanted him to have his own. But finally, I caved. And he became May, and he became Little May because it's the South. And what I did not expect was for that to provoke a really sweet relationship between them. I think it also gave him more of a sense of belonging to my family. And then when I would unfortunately yell out, get the ball, May, at the baseball and things like that, other people heard me call him May, and then they started calling him May. So now he has a million nicknames. But it had everything to do with me wanting him to be an individual, but he's really part of a family.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you.
I have a cousin, his name is Harry Four. And for the longest time when I was young, I used to call him Harry Four. And I never realized that meant that he was the 4th. And then my uncle, we used to call him the Don. Mom comes from a family where the men are rich and the women are sexy. And that's just it. That's just the way it is.
There you go. There you go. Anything over here before I get too captivated by the other side? Yeah.
So when Dan and I were not long after we were married, we got an adorable little basset hound. And we named her Margaret Elizabeth Van Horn. And so I do think that said something. I mean, obviously she didn't get to pick it, and she looked more like a cute basset hound name, but Margaret Elizabeth Van Horn, because I wanted her to be named that, like that was sophisticated and not in keeping with really a basset hound, but that just was my way of making her into what I wanted her to be, I guess. I don't know.
Thank you. So the point, of course, we have time for one more. I'm going to talk till the mic gets to you. The point, of course, is that we think of naming in one way, certainly when we read the power of Genesis, but the story of Genesis, but that does show the power Adam had, but it says more about Adam in many cases than about the things he named. Yes.
Well, I think you just spoke to what I was going to bring up, that, the power to name is a power. And in all the stories that we've kind of been talking about, these are, we as parents have named our children, or we as grown-ups have named our pets, or we were named as children by our parents. And so I think the power to name is very powerful. And I think as I've listened to the story as it's unfolded thus far, I mean, we've gotten to know who Adam is, but I still have no idea who Eve is yet. So.
That is a wonderful transition. Thank you very much. All right, let's explore who Eve might be. Did Eve trick Adam into eating the apple? This was a specific question asked. Here's the text I think is helpful. Who told thee that thou wast naked? From the tree I commanded thee not to eat, hast thou eaten? And the man said, the woman whom thou gavest by me, she gave me from the tree, and I did eat. There's an old story about this. Adam attempts to avoid responsibility by shifting the blame, not only to Eve, who gave him the tree, but also to God. Did you pick up on that? It's not just Eve, it's you too, buddy. I mean, what? I didn't ask for her. You just gave her, and the next thing I know. All right. He has a point, right? Eve was given to him as a remedy for aloneness that could keep him from pursuing the forbidden knowledge, and she has, in fact, led him right to it. That's the old story, told by men for generations. What's wrong with this story? Eve didn't trick Adam in the sense of deceiving or manipulating him into doing what he did. Think about the word trick. That's not what she did. So the answer to the question is no, she didn't trick him. But what did happen? Some interpreters have argued that Eve persuaded Adam, a much nicer word, to act, and in that sense bears more moral responsibility than he does for their disobedience. So did she trick him? No, but she was kind of leading the action, and while it may have been a conspiracy, she was the lead conspirator. Adam didn't actually say that she tricked him. Eve attempts to avoid responsibility by shifting blame to the serpent. So you remember, not in that scriptural pericope, but the next, when God comes to Eve, she has her own kind of blame-shifting attempt. It wasn't me, it was that snake. And she's right about that in some ways. She does claim that the serpent beguiled her. Beguiled in the Hebrew there means lifted up. The serpent lifted her up. God does not seem to attribute some value to their defenses. Did you notice that? He blames Eve. She blames the serpent. He blames God. What does God say in response? Really nothing to that. He clearly took nurtured heart. I was claiming before, telling him not to eat of the tree, suggests he never took any parenting class. But now I'm suggesting he did take a parenting class because he doesn't give any energy to that negativity. right? He just lets it go and moves on to what is going to happen. God does seem to attribute some value to their defenses. God curses the serpent, so he does curse somebody. He doesn't curse either Adam or Eve, though he does curse the ground for Adam's sake. Making excuses does admit that something needs to be excused. Does that make sense? So when God says, did you eat? They confess, and in their confession try to shift blame somewhere else. The mere effort to shift blame somewhere else suggests there's blame that has to rest somewhere. There's moral value to the act, but not tricking. That doesn't capture what really happened, nor does it open up the scripture to help us in how to live. If he had simply tricked him, then we know that tricking is morally bad. We can move on. That's not what the scripture is trying to tell us, I think. But it is, I want to pause, though, and talk about the serpent. Do you guys know Nagini? This is Nagini. Nagini is a snake in Harry Potter, which is a far more helpful description of the serpent than we find in Genesis. But the serpent, so Koss suggests, is the embodiment of the separated and beguiling, remember that word, lifted up, voice of autonomous human reason. So, i.e., the serpent is human reason abstracted from desire, abstracted from the body, abstracted from context, if you will. It comes to us as if from some attractive source outside that whispers doubt into our ear. So what he's pointing out there is that reason, disembodied, is dangerous. Reason, disembodied, is dangerous. He's not the first to suggest this, of course. But we often think that reason is the highest good. And if it's reasonable, it must be true. If we can analytically get to that point, we've gotten to the right point. And in doing so, I think we forget the role that emotion plays in how we decide what to do. And my sense is that reason, unaided by emotion, would never even get to an answer. It would just do what it does in my brain all the time. Spin. You're thinking, and then you're thinking about thinking, and pretty soon you're thinking about thinking about thinking. And then you need to go pray. Why do you need to go pray? You need to go pray because you need to get out of that cycle. You need to get out of that part of your brain, out of that left hemisphere whose primary purpose is to distinguish good from bad, to distinguish one thing from another, which is why the word not, as it appears in Genesis, is such a prominent and important word, because we often know what we are or what something is by what it is not. Would I know what black is if it wasn't white? Would I know what blue is if it wasn't red? Would I know what a cat is if it wasn't a dog? We are constantly trying to figure out what is not true in order to figure out what is true. It's just part of the way our brain works. This is also why speech, which is primarily resident in that left hemisphere, right, is the only weapon the serpent has. Speech is the only weapon the serpent has, because it's almost like it's that part of the brain operating in a way disconnected from the other part of your brain, the right hemisphere of your brain, which looks for commonality and connection and wholeness. We've talked before about the idea that what has happened since the Enlightenment is that we as human beings have begun to develop that left hemisphere, that analytical thinking part of ourselves, to great success, right? We've spurred the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution, the civilization that we enjoy so many benefits of. All of that was about figuring stuff out. Turns out that while it looks like we're circling around, the sun is circling around us, that's not what's happening, right? So I'm not arguing that reason is bad or that intellect is inhibiting by its very nature. I'm not arguing that we don't enjoy many of the fruits of this focus on our analytical thought processes. because I think we do. Some of us even start in our heads all the time. It's not a bad thing. You just don't want to leave the other part out. The other part that sees the wholeness of things, that sees the connectedness of things, that sees the tone and character and sense of things, they are to be brought together. My suggestion to you has been that as Christians, we are really to start in the right side of our brain, which is where I think the Holy Spirit actually resides. That sense that there's a deep connectedness. When Julia, in her brilliant sermon this morning, is going through, I forgot the words, I can't kill, remember the story she told about the assassination that went awry because the assassin said, I can't because you're the Lord's. Was that what it was? You're the Lord's? Right brain. You're the Lord's. I suddenly see this connectedness. You and I are both children of God. Your dignity, your sanctity, your very life is sacred, and I cannot take it because at some level to do so would be to kill myself. That's your right brain functioning, is what I'm arguing. He didn't get there by thinking things through. He got there by getting there with the intent to carry out a contract murder and being overcome with the humanity of this holy man, so that the holiness that he experienced manifests in the righteousness that he then acted upon. Does that make sense? So in my view, discernment in the Christian sense, you start with your right hemisphere in prayer or awareness or stillness or breathing or however you do it. There's an issue that must be addressed that gets delegated to your left hemisphere, which does what it needs to do in terms of processing and distinguishing, getting to an answer that is then confirmed by the right hemisphere. Does it fit? Does it make sense? Now, if you think this is just something I picked up out of first century writings, think about what you heard in the commentators during the Masters. Anybody watch the golf tournament? If not, I'll be doing confession later and you can get... There's this increase, I'm finding it fascinating because year after year after year, there's a growing focus on method. How do the golfers do what they do? So Tiger Woods, for example, the minute he crosses the boundary line of Augusta, he adopts a pace and he doesn't vary it. Whether he's going to the bathroom or walking to get his putter, it's the same pace. Why? Because he wants to get his body modulated. He wants to get his emotions modulated. Or if you watch the guy that won the Masters, it wasn't clear at times he was alive, right? He was so non-responsive, or if you will, reactive to what was going on. Whereas if you watch some other competitors who were in the hunt, if you will, you could see it in their bodies. They were thinking, right? They were thinking. I don't know what they were, maybe swing thoughts, but I think more it's about, that was really bad what happened on the last hole. And if I don't correct that here, I'm in trouble because then there are 2 birdie holes and this guy's 3 strokes ahead of me, right? That's all thinking. That's all fear. That's all anxiety. That's all what? Living in the future or living in the past, which is what your left hemisphere does. Your right hemisphere, by its very nature, lives in the present, which is why you're trying, when we say be mindful, that's what you're trying to do. All that is prayerful, the way we think of it in the Christian tradition. So I would suggest that whether it's golf, the most sacred of all sports, or whether it's football or tennis or I don't know what else, women's basketball, you can find the same things. The people who are excelling at those sports are not only working on their bodies physically, but they're working on their minds and how they play the game, right? So it's life is what I'm saying. It's just in the throes of competition, you get to see it and how they do it. But I don't know how many baseball players now have a sports psychologist that's with them. Who did that 3 generations? Jackie Robinson didn't have a sports psychologist, right? So all I'm saying is this thing about prayer in your brain and how it works and the just method of discernment that has you start in a place of connectedness, address your problem analytically, which is fundamentally about separation, and then return to a place of connectedness in order to confirm your answer will yield different results. And it's consistent with what's happening in Genesis and what's happening at Augusta National. The same thing. All of which requires your kind of taming of the serpent. All right, so what's the story to live by? Whether Eve tricked or persuaded Adam to do what he did is the wrong question. You see the rhetorical trick I'm playing on you. I posited these questions, and I quickly tell you that's the wrong question, so I can answer what I really wanted to answer anyway. The better question, the one that yields more wisdom, is why did they each do what they did? Why did they do what they did? For Eve, I'm quoting Koss here, for Eve, the eating of the fruit merely symbolizes her choice, her free will. And that's based on her own belief that eating would be good. Why does she desire the fruit of the tree? Because she thinks it would be good. It's desire. See that? She didn't analytically get there and say, I need to do it. It's desire that works through her actions. Her conversation with a serpent, a symbol that awakens her awareness of needs beyond God's command and the world's ability to satisfy. Do you see that? They're sitting in the garden. They've got everything they want. They have no need at all. But the serpent persuades her that there's more. So what happens to her desire? She wants more. And how does she figure that out? Well, it seems good. Why is it good? Why is it good? Why is being able to distinguish between good and bad a good thing? I'm leaving you to answer that question. Why is it good? But what I want you to see is that desire for more pre-exists her eating the fruit. In fact, it's a necessary stimulus to her action to begin with. Only a being who already distinguishes good from bad, already has some sense of what they ought to be doing or what they want to do, has opinions about what to do and can make the choice. Now, here's the interesting part. For Adam, it doesn't really seem to be about the fruit, does it? It's really kind of about Eve. Adam just wants to make Eve happy, please her, or receive her approval, your choice. But do you see the difference? Eve has gone through this very intricate conversation, the first conversation, with the serpent, where we get some sense of what's going on and we can almost watch her self-awareness emerge. But Adam, he's like, fruit, sure. Why? So what Koss is claiming is that desire is different. Hold on, Lions, I'll get right to you. The desire there is different. All right. So, Lions, you had a question about this before we go to the other question, which I'm not going to do, actually, so don't worry about this question.
First of all, I'm struggling with the talking snake, in the story.
Harry Potter, man. It's going to answer all your questions.
Okay. Well, I'm struggling with that part of the talking snake.
Yeah.
And secondly, I have to reveal it's so discomforting to me. I don't know what percentage of people in the room are deathly afraid of snakes. I go into that part you talk about where this is survival mode and anyway, so that's my other part. And I'm going to go into the biblical a little bit. Didn't Moses take a snake and knock it down and make the staff? Isn't that what they followed?
Yeah, they raised the serpent up on the staff.
So why?
As the doctor symbol today, whatever that
As
is.
a symbol of?
As a symbol of the evil that was poisoning
isn't that what they
the
followed?
people.
So that was to be?
Because to look at the evil is to be healed from the evil, to rob it of its poisonous, toxic power.
You're blowing my mind today, George. I just want you to know that.
And never have I enjoyed it more, Lions, I got to say. Yeah, well, so he's talking about, the symbol of doctors, but we'll come back to that at another point. John.
So a couple of things. One, your discussion about Eve not having enough reminded me of the book they're discussing across the way there, Never Enough. But I think it's worth pointing out, I'm looking at this and thinking your suggestion that Eve persuaded Adam to eat of the fruit, that she had eaten of the fruit, and so she knew that she had done wrong, and she desired for Adam to be there with her, but that, which I think is a human characteristic, that, you know, if you've done wrong, oh, yeah, hey, come do wrong with me.
Yeah, yeah. Or it was great.
So you do it too.
Well, I mean, if you think it's like talking about God, and why do we have to be quiet about God? If it's making our life come alive, why would we not share it with somebody else? So maybe, I don't know. I mean, could be. This gets back into the, just don't take the simple answers to this story. It probes human nature to great depth. But Randy had his hand up and then Dan. So Joseph, you can come up to Dan.
I've been thinking a lot the last 6 or 8 months on the polarity between the left brain and the right brain that you were talking about, and the need to balance them. And one thing I came up with was the power of music. You know, I think about Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and the power of music, and you think about it, there's left brain and right brain. There's a concept of the music that Beethoven has. Then he uses the mathematics to get there, and what you get is this incredibly powerful experience. And I think that's a great metaphor for what you're talking about.
Yes, thank you, Randy. I think music is a wonderful metaphor. And I would say it, like many excellent metaphors, operates on two different levels. So number one, for many of us, I think listening to music gets us into our right hemisphere. It sounds so terribly technical, but you might think of it as our deeper mind, right? Into a stillness as it kind of frustrates, if you will, it frustrates the left hemisphere by occupying just the way centering prayer does, or a meditation does, or a mantra does. It literally frustrates your ability to think. If you're focusing on your breathing, you can't think. If you're repeating a mantra, you can't think. So it intentionally frustrates the operation of the left hemisphere, which makes the right available to you. So you control stuff in the left, but you only encounter it in the right. So I think that's excellent. Here's the part of it. I was talking to a professional musician recently who said, yeah, George, but a professional musician does both at the same time. And I thought, well, of course you do, right? Because I think the fuller life, that's what we're all trying to learn how to do both at the same time. I'm offering a kind of right, left, right discernment methodology, but it doesn't matter. The point is, you want to use all your brain. You want to use all brain. I guess I would say that I think our right brain is also what we often call the heart. I don't really see difference between those two things, just to give you a sense of how my definitions work out. So Dan.
I just had to touch on the golf thing just for a minute.
Thank you.
And you'll see it throughout sports. Are you results oriented or are you process oriented? And so the greatest golfers have become process oriented, and they're not letting the bad results that happen on the whole back get in the way of their routine and their process. So everything is all the same to do the process and not get into results thinking.
Yeah, I love that. Right. So who won the Masters?
Scotty Scheffler.
Do you remember what he said? First of all, you know, his wife was pregnant, ready to deliver any day, and he'd already announced, no matter where he was leaving if she went into labor. That's interesting. Secondly, what he said, I think what he said, or maybe his dad said about him, is, my identity is being a child of God, right? I'm very competitive. I deeply want to win. I wish I wasn't so competitive, but my identity is being a child of God. Golf is what I do. Who I am is a child of God. It's a great example, I think, of exactly all the stuff we're talking about. So I use a lot of fancy words, but there's your picture, right, of what we're trying to say. All right, we've kind of run out of time, but I do want to get to this because I want you to have it. Why did God expel, and I'm not going to be here next week. I got to do a funeral on the coast. Why did God expel Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden? Well, the old story, of course, is pride. It's punishment for pride. But what's wrong with that story? It suggests that God is vengeful, seeking revenge, or needs to extract some kind of pain and suffering, which is the very same point that Dean was making in his sermon on Good Friday about atonement theories. If you heard that, if not, you may want to look at it online. That they all kind of assume that God's got to get something back for the wrong that humanity has done, which we as Anglicans think is not true. God is not hostile to human beings, as the serpent suggests, but generous and loving, which is why we're here. So really, it's Eve who converts the predicted dire consequences of disobedience. The way it's written in Genesis is, for in that day thou eatest thereof, dying you will die. Dying you will die, by the way, has a whole nother PhD thesis associated with it, but I'll spare you. But she converts the consequences of disobedience into the reason for the disobedience. For in that day thou eatest thereof, dying you will die. The reason for disobedience, you shall not eat of it lest you die. The first is what God said. The second is how she quoted God to the serpent. See the difference? What God said is, if you eat it, it's all going to bad. It's not going to work for you. Not, I'm going to do it to you. Not, I'm standing here with a switch and I'm going to beat you if you step over that line. Instead, don't do it. Don't run out into traffic. Don't eat the fourth ice cream sundae. Because it's not going to work for you, right? As a parent, we all know that. We're trying to get our children to do those things that will keep them safe, make them happy, etc. But when she hears it, she hears it as, don't eat of it lest you die, i.e. something I'm going to do to you. We, for some reason, have accepted for generations Eve's understanding. But I want to persuade you that Eve's understanding is a look into our own lives and the way we think and act. And how often do we take something that is offered as guidance for our well-being as a rule that's going to result in punishment? My 12-year-old does this on a daily basis, right? One time we disciplined Robert for something. He was about 8, and he was stomped around. Finally, Mary Hunter said, Robert, what is wrong with you? And he said, the consequence continues. Yeah, we didn't do it. You know, you ate the fourth ice cream sundae. I don't know why. So anyway, a different way to think about God. What I'm claiming is that God didn't banish them for the garden as punishment for their wickedness any more than God killed his only son Jesus as punishment for our wrongdoing. Which gets back to whether calling this the fall is actually helpful. The fall doesn't appear in Genesis anywhere. We have created that. I don't like it. And I don't like it because I think it leads us to believe we've done something wrong and we had to suffer. And that leads us into bad atonement theory, and that leads us into misguided imaginings of God. And if you think God is wrathful and punishing you, you will act differently than if you think God is loving. Maybe you don't need to shift the blame. Maybe the way to life, to full life, is to own the blame, for example. All right, you see, I hope that I had much more to say. Little Bible trivia, what's the first metaphor of the Bible? Your eyes shall be opened, meaning you will have insight. You will have insight. Henry David Thoreau famously said, it's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see that matters. It's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. What we are doing here in studying Scripture and trying to live together and learning how to pray is learning to see the world differently, to see God's presence and workings in the world, and not to be trapped by superficial readings of what's happening that are motivated by fear and anxiety. That's the payoff, if you will, for our faith, to live into reality as it really is and not let our fears trap us into half-truths. The question I would have had you discuss is, can you think of a time when you realized that you have everything you needed? I wrote this before I heard Julia's sermon. This is exactly what Julia's talking about. This is exactly what the book is addressing that they're covering in the other class. Can you think, so you can take it as homework, can you think of a time when you just realized that you had everything you needed? Because the real interesting thing about your answer will be, and what did you have to give up to come to that conclusion? You had to give up something because there's always more, right? Kids could be smarter. House could be nicer. You could have better friends, probably not better friends. There's always more, so what happens when you decide that you have enough? Something happens spiritually This is not just about accept your gifts. I'm never going to be hungry, blah, blah, blah. I don't think that's what the real spiritual truth here is. There's a change in the way you see the world when you think you've got enough. And my mother, who loved beautiful things, jewelry, dresses, art. If she had $1 billion, she'd spend it. And she would love every penny. If she had nothing, she would not be any less happy. She never said that. It's just clear to me. I mean, I watched my mother in places that I won't name that are highly exclusive, and she thought that was really great fun. And I watched my mother take her grandchildren onto the city buses in Savannah not because she thought they ought to learn, but because it was fun. So she had certain things in life and she enjoyed them. Had she not had them, she would have found another way to have fun. That's what it means, I think, to have enough, right? Not, when I was practicing law, we used to have something we called FU money. Does this ring a bell with some of you older guys? Yeah. It's not about that. It's about knowing that you're going to be okay, whatever it is. Be responsible and all that kind of stuff. But it's not like I've hit my mark and now I can go. And everything I do, that's result-oriented, right? It's not about that. So realizing you have everything that you need is a spiritual posture, not an analytical result. And what did we learn? We'll come back to that because I got to welcome people in about 3 minutes. But I know it's been a lot, but I hope it's been helpful. What I really want you to do is to think about this creation story as not telling us what happened, but telling us what always happens. It's not history. It's not science. It's not even basic theology, really. It's about how human beings live in the world. And what we want from it is what we can learn from it in order to live more fully, right? Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.